This is Seeking Delphi, episode number 18, the UK through 2030 Post-Brexit. I'm Mark Sackler. The future lives here. Through much of our inaugural year, this podcast has focused on future challenges and changes centered around technology. That's included artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, biotechnology, and hydrogen fuel cells, just to name a few. But professional futurists focus their foresight projects on more than just technology. The acronym STEEP for Social, Technology, Economic, Environment, and Politics comes into play to paint a broader picture of where civilization is headed. One of the most pressing current global issues, with potential far-ranging implications well into the future, involves the social, economic, and political implications of Brexit, the 2016 vote by the UK to leave the European Union. It represents a major victory for forces of nationalism and populism over globalization. But there's a long, rocky journey on the road toward achieving that exit, and the ultimate destination is anything but clear. One UK organization that recently took a long, hard look at the issues involved and where they might lead Britain, its allies, and trading partners over the next several years, is SAMI Consulting. They recently published a report outlining 4 scenarios for a post-Brexit UK between now and 2030. Today's guest is one of the participants and authors in that study. Speaking to me from his office in the UK is Jonathan Blanchard Smith. Jonathan, thank you for joining me.
It's my pleasure.
So, Jonathan, let's start out by giving our listeners a little bit of background on who you are and what SAMI Consulting is.
I'm a fellow at SAMI Consulting. Originally, I trained as a linguist in a number of languages, sort of obscure and less obscure. My primary language is Arabic, but I've also got a number of other languages of the region. Became a corporate troubleshooter for many years and joined SAMI Consulting as fellow a few months back. SAMI's been going for 30 years. The initials actually mean St Andrews Management Institute because it's a spin-off from St Andrews University some 30 years ago and was bought out by the staff about 15 years back. And we're a boutique strategy house specializing in scenarios, foresight, futures thinking, particularly strategy with a view of the future. It's remarkable how much strategy starts from where you are as opposed to where you want to go to. And we use a lot of our foresight work to, as it were, build the strategy back from your ideal position. And you'll see us on Twitter with a particular hashtag, which is robust decisions, because we say that we allow people to create robust decisions in uncertain times. And this is very uncertain times that needs very robust decisions.
Jonathan, to get right to the heart of the matter, SAMI has produced a report, Britain in 2030, 4 post-Brexit scenarios. Tell us about the motivation and methodology for this report.
Well, I think the motivation is quite clear. Britain is in the middle of this remarkable and, to many people who live in the country, strange, well, certainly many people who live in Europe, strange exercise of separating off from the European Union. It's a long process. We had a referendum over a year ago. We were having the discussions for that referendum for a year before that. We won't finally leave Europe until March 2019, assuming everything goes as currently planned. And we then have an implementation period that follows that may well be another 2 years. So there's an awful lot of time for people to argue and worry and have views about what the future looks like and about what we're doing now. We wanted to bring our skills to lift that discussion away from the immediate here and now into a more long-term based vision of where we saw the UK, but also Europe and the world in 2030. And we picked 2030 because it was a sort of a medium-term horizon. It's a predictable, not a predictable, it's a modelable place. A number of things, when you see the projection work we've done, we've been able, by modeling it that close, to cut out things like climate change because we don't think it's going to be that influential by 2030, whereas if we were doing it by 2050, obviously, the situation would have changed again. We built a scenario set around two basic axes, one between economic focus and social cohesion. Whilst they're not opposed to each other, one can stretch, the more socially cohesive, by and large, the less economically focused, and vice versa. And the other one on globalization versus fragmentation, versus localization and fragmentation. So opposing those two axes against each other then gave us four models, which we called the global common approach, global competition, localization, and then fragmentation and competition. And that gave us a good working set of scenarios to project forward to.
All right, so now let's look at these four scenarios, perhaps from a 40,000-foot view, starting with the globalization, common, and competition scenarios. How would you characterize those?
I think if you, there's an easy way of thinking about global common approach, and that's the Olympics. It's all nations working towards a common cause, the international structure of international organizations, pan-national organizations, working for clear common aims, and a very much more a sort of integrated world with a set of integrated objectives, understanding where it wants to go and what it wants to achieve. And particularly that would include things like United Nations work, social justice, climate change, obviously, facing the big challenges of the day, united as one group of people working together. Global competition, so that's the global common approach is sort of globalization plus social cohesion. When you put globalization plus economic focus, you're starting to get a more less unified approach towards the social events and more unified towards the economics. So it's a much more capitalist world, as it were. There are the links between nations tend to be much more about global trading bodies rather than global social bodies. For Britain, that's an interesting scenario. It allows people to be allows competition, but within a context that is less argumentative between powers.
Okay, now let's move on and get your take on the localization and fragmentation quadrants. Localization first, and then fragmentation and competition.
You're doing well here. I mean, it depends if you're a localist or a globalist to which order you take these in, but I personally think of them in the same order that you're running them through. Localization is interesting. We're looking at a much more, nations are becoming much more concerned about the people within their own borders. There is a diminishment in the international bodies as people are starting to focus within themselves, but bilateral agreements have to be structured in a way that nations can continue to cooperate. So, as it were, you have a set of diversified groups rather than a set of unified groups. The access to the various elements of international trade become important. We do think in this particular model, and we've seen it in Catalonia recently, we've seen it certainly in Britain with the Scottish referendum of a couple of years ago. We think this model, which places emphasis on social cohesion within certain smaller groups rather than big transnational groups, encourages the smaller nations to seek smaller loci of identity, to seek their independence, to go their own way. Fragmentation and and competition is an extreme form of the global competition. So we have both localization and a highly competitive environment. Now, this is in some respects again reflected in what we're seeing today. You see it in America First models. You see it in the way Europe is developing into one or two speeds. So you have a sort of a fortress in Europe and a fortress in the US. When you have situations like that, the sort of the bipolar world or the unipolar world starts to collapse and people start looking for individual national advantage. That's also then implying not a collapse, but a diminution in international bodies, diminution in their importance, or whether even people are paying any attention to them at all, but an increase in the importance of bilateral agreements, because after all, one is constantly attempting to seek competitive advantage, and the best way of doing that is within bilateral agreements. So you end up arbitraging one nation's relationship with you against another.
Jonathan, now let's, if you will, move on to some peripheral issues. The first one being, how is this going to affect the EU itself? Britain's now outside the EU. They're affected, obviously. Is there much effect on the EU no longer having Britain, and how does that play out in the various scenarios?
Well, I think one has to be very careful. The difference between sort of making a prediction and building scenarios is that one attempts to avoid, unless specifically asked to, one attempts to avoid what can be seen as sort of an expressly political opinion. We project within these four scenarios everything from the EU becoming a strong multinational player in a multinational environment to essentially the EU calibrating itself down to its core, removing the various peripheral countries falling away, and the core essentially being the Western Europe of the original EU. But in terms of Brexit, that's less important. We've seen politically in the last year, the EU is not particularly focused on Brexit. The EU has a lot more valuable and important things that it thinks it needs to be concerned with. Britain is all encompassed by Brexit because it's happening to us, whereas for the EU, this is simply part of a set of issues that they're facing, and the EU leadership have made it very clear that they are looking into the future in a way, acknowledging that they are no longer 28 but 27, in a way that relegates Brexit to being simply another negotiation point.
So let's take that and extrapolate out a little further to a global picture. And in that regard, how will the UK's relationship be affected, if it will at all, with some of the other major global powers? The US, China, and Russia obviously come directly to mind. And how will they fare in the different scenarios with those relationships?
I think it changes drastically once you leave the EU. I think that's your first major foreign policy change as far as Britain's concerned for the last 40 years. So you go from being the bridge between America and Europe that we have certainly post-war postulated ourselves as being. And in the last 20 years, we've done enormously well by being the English language middle time zone place that international companies can use in order to access Europe. I think that's likely to change significantly, but the various scenarios influence the way it changes. Within the global common approach, Britain becomes a player. It retains its United Nations Security Council seat. It remains a nuclear power. It remains in NATO, and all of its various relationships remain intact, and those relationships become valuable and important. I think it's much more difficult to see how that postulates, how that holds together in the fragmentation approach, where it is one of many nations fighting to maintain a position whilst they're all amongst each other. And obviously places like China, India, America, and the EU itself, I mean, these large population strong economic powerhouses, when Britain is an independent nation of whatever will be 65, 66 million people, you're in a different ballpark rather than being part of a group of 500 million, for instance. So it's more complex, significantly more complex, I think, for Britain in the fragmentation scenario. But again, that's a dependency on, it's not just a dependency on Britain. I mean, one of the things that comes out very clearly from the scenario work is that there are opportunities for Britain under any of these scenarios. Some of them are distinctly more disguised than others, but there are ways of approaching this where one can pull out ways forwards for, and we say Britain as if it was sort of a single homogeneous lump, but in fact, of course, what we're talking about is this, historically important trading nation with its significant political weight, attempting to make its way in the world whilst not sacrificing its trade or its political weight. And we've tried to look for ways of making that happen. We can see that it's easier in some scenarios than others, but they certainly all have opportunities for each of them.
All right, so much for the easy questions, Jonathan. Now I'm going to throw you a curveball. And pardon me if this isn't something you've considered, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And that is there a scenario, have you considered the possibility that at some point there might be enough pushback on this that there's enough sentiment to say, gee, this was a mistake, we shouldn't do it, stop the process? Or if the process is complete, maybe we should consider trying to go back to the EU?
Well, yes. We actually produced this particular scenario set to coincide with the party conference season in Britain. All of our political parties have their conferences at about the same time, separated by a week from each. And we were concerned to bring our skill and experience and ability at dealing with scenarios to allow the politicians to lift their minds away from the immediate day-to-day and actually see these problems in the round. We didn't therefore consider it necessarily right to introduce what could be regarded as a political view. You could argue that our global common approach would work rather well were Britain to decide that Brexit was overly complex or overly expensive or simply impossible to carry out without causing grave economic damage to the country. I have to say that at the moment the referendum was narrow, but there is no sign in the government or generally within the opinion polls that anything is going to turn into anything as grand as a reversal of this particular plan. But again, as I've said, we have another 17 months from today before we officially leave. So there is plenty of opportunity for things to change. One has to remember that the British are distinctly more phlegmatic than many other nations, and it takes an awful lot to get the British out on the streets. I think things would have to look very bad indeed for Brexit to be reversed. I think there's a possibility that you might, as it were, have a rolling Brexit, so that your 2-year implementation period, we get to the end of that and we go, well, actually, we'd like another 2 years. That's possible. And it's equally possible that the final deal will be along a model that is very closely aligned with the European Union as it is. If it was, for instance, the European Economic Area or the European Free Trade Association, both of those groupings are very tightly aligned with the EU, and we would achieve many of the levers' objectives by sort of, as it were, bolting ourselves onto these pre-made arrangements as opposed to trying to make an arrangement for ourselves. The Canada-EU free trade agreement still has problems, and it took 7 years to negotiate, and I don't think the British government is envisaging 7 years to negotiate a relationship.
Okay, one other specific here, and that's, it's a big issue. Immigration's a big issue here in the U.S. We've seen the pushback in Germany. I think in the U.K. you've also got the issue with the kind of open borders with the EU. You've got a lot of people from other EU countries in Britain now. I think maybe some of them working or just living. How do they fare under various different scenarios? How's that going to be dealt with?
One has to remember there's an awful lot of Immigration is always a very useful scare story. And whilst it may be good for the political campaigning, it's not, in fact, as either complex or as intractable as it looks if you simply want a headline. There are 3 million European Union citizens in Britain. Britain retains control over its borders. We're outside the Schengen Agreement within the European Union, so we don't actually have open borders. We never have had. The predominance of the immigrants, vast predominance over here, are either working or temporary from Europe. The example one always has is the Poles, who aren't working over here because they want to live here. They're working over here because they want to send money back to Poland and go back there with quite a lot more money than they could earn here. Under a global common approach, again, you would see much more open borders, much less concern over, this is one of what the EU calls the four freedoms, the freedom to work anywhere within the European Union. That wouldn't be a concern. With fragmentation and localization, and with the fragmentation scenarios, the interesting problem there for a nation is how do you attract the immigrants who you need in order to do the thing that you need your nation to do to succeed. So, for instance, if you were going to specialize in a number of industries, which we think you would probably have to do if you were going to be a small independent country, for instance, aerospace, how would you set up an immigration program to attract the best aerospace engineers? So effectively, you would still have an immigration issue, but you would be doing it significantly more selectively, whether you do it like a green card system or a points-based system like they have in Australia. But certainly, even prior to departing the EU, even whilst we're members of the European Union, our borders in terms of people coming in to stay or live or work are still not half as open as people would have you believe.
Okay, I'm going to just ask one final question, which is going to put you on the spot to the point that I'm going to say you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, but if you personally had to pick which of these scenarios is most likely to occur, is most probable, which one would it be and why?
Okay, I need to add a proviso, which is that we've been extremely careful not to weight these scenarios. So we haven't given any particular scenario as being the most obvious, as being the most likely. And we haven't done that because, as I say, we prepared this document specifically so that people could lift their eyes off the immediate day-to-day and, as you say, go for the 40,000-foot helicopter view. Looking at where we're going at the moment, and this is a personal view, not endorsed by my firm, it looks to me like the fragmentation and competition scenario is where the world seems to be going. There seems to be less focus on international cooperation, more focus on populist politics, almost by definition, mean that you have to focus on the populace. So there's more focus on the internal issues within countries. There is America First in the US is a very good example of what happens when you start trying to close down your borders, repatriate labor, repatriate capital. And the only question about that really is going to be what is the influence of this enormous counterweight in China, which relies on large global trades in order for it to generate the funds it needs to succeed, but also which is very significantly invested in a lot of these countries. So it seems to me to be marginally more likely that fragmentation and competition is where we are heading. But this is a 13-year projection out from now. You have, therefore, at least 2 American elections. We have at least 2 UK elections, and we have Brexit to go through. So by the end of the period, it's not impossible that you'll find that this populist, as they finding in Europe now with the election of Macron and other mid-range politicians, Kurz in Austria just recently, you may well find that, in fact, what you've got is a knee-jerk to populism, and then, as it were, the globalizers realizing that this was a danger and pulling it back over the next couple of elections.
Jonathan, very, very interesting and well thought out presentation of your scenarios. And I thank you very much for your time, and of course wish Britain and the EU all the best of luck, whatever turns out.
Frankly, we'll take it wherever it comes from at the moment. I'm starting to feel we need it. Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure.
If the future of Brexit sounds complex, consider some of these issues in the present, each of which has been in the news in just the past few days. BBC News reported that healthcare in the UK might be adversely affected by Brexit, including putting access to new medical technology at risk, increasing some medicine costs, and dampening pharmaceutical investment. The Guardian reports that at least one winemaker fears that a post-Brexit labor shortage might force the importation of grapes. And the need for resolution of a long-standing border dispute with Ireland vis-à-vis Northern Ireland is also one of the prerequisites for an exit deal with the EU. As the title character often repeats in the BBC TV series, Dirk Gently's holistic detective agency, everything is connected. Elsewhere, cars of the electric and/or self-driving variety continue to dominate the news. General Motors announced an ambitious plan to launch an autonomous vehicle ride-sharing program by 2019. California has ditched plans for limiting manufacturer liability in self-driving vehicle accidents. The CBC reports that Ontario has zero chance of meeting its 2020 electric vehicle goals. But of course, the biggest headlines always seem to go to Elon Musk, who said he plans to send one of his Tesla Roadsters into orbit around Mars. It was not immediately clear if he was joking, but consider the upside. In the inertia of the Martian orbit, it won't ever need a charging station. My thanks to guest Jonathan Blanchard Smith and to you for joining me. My technical advisor is Mohammed Maroof. Seeking Delphi cover art is by Kai Stakoviak. And until next time, I'm Mark Sackler.